Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Leanne, and I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. Today we're going to be joined by Peter Small. He's returning once again. He has been on the History Channel. He's performed at all the presidential libraries, and he is going to be entertaining us today with his rendition of Moses.
It has been such a long journey. It has been 40 years since we left Egypt, and I am making my last appearance before you because I'm about to climb Mount Nebo, where I will spend my final years. But do not follow me, for I have been commanded by the Lord to spend my final days there, and from there to see Joshua lead the children of Israel across the Jordan River into the promised land of Canaan. I will not join them, for I am already an old man, 120 years old. But I also disobeyed the Lord, and I will tell you about that later. But my story begins not 40 years ago when we left Egypt, not even 120 years ago when I was born, but more than 400 years ago, when my ancestors, our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, dwelled in the land of Canaan, the land that the Lord promised to them and their descendants. And Jacob, who would later be called Israel, had 12 sons. His favorite was Joseph, for whom he made a coat of many colors. But his brothers grew jealous of him because he was his father's favorite. And one day when he was out in the field, they kidnapped him and sold him into slavery in Egypt. In Egypt, he was falsely accused of a crime and sent to prison. But in prison, he gained a reputation as an interpreter of dreams. And one day, many years later, when one of the staff of the great Pharaoh, the great ruler of Egypt, who had once been falsely imprisoned, remembered Joseph. For you see, the Pharaoh had this dream that he could not understand, nor could his visors, nor could his sorcerers, or any of his ministers explain his dream. And this member of the royal staff had remembered Joseph. And Joseph was summoned before the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh explained his dream to Joseph, that he had dreamed that 7 healthy cows had been devoured by 7 lean cows. 7 healthy ears of corn had been replaced by 7 sickly ears of corn. Although no one on the staff could understand, Joseph did. And he explained to Pharaoh what it meant. That Egypt would have 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of drought and famine. And he understood that he stood in the presence of genius. And he realized that Egypt had to prepare for the future. So he made Joseph the minister over all of Egypt. And under Joseph's leadership, Egypt prepared during its 7 years of prosperity, built great granaries for storage, for grain during the times of famine. And while there was famine in much of that region, there was not any in Egypt, for they had listened to the advice of their great minister Joseph. But there was famine in the land of Canaan. And Jacob and his 12 sons had heard that there was food in Egypt. So they journeyed down to Egypt. There they were reunited with Joseph. And they were allowed to dwell in the land of Egypt, in Goshen specifically, where the children of Israel and their descendants would dwell. But many years later, a new dynasty arose in Egypt, a new dynasty that did not know of or care about the contributions of Joseph and our people. And he feared that the children of Israel would not be loyal to Egypt in time of an invasion. So he enslaved the children of Israel, made us build cities such as Pithoms and Ramses, and toil harshly in Egypt, in the mortar and brick of Egypt. And when he feared that we grew too numerous, he ordered that the firstborn son of every house of Israel was to be killed. I was the firstborn son of my parents, and my mother Yocheved hid me for as long as she could. When it was no longer possible to conceal me, she built a basket of reeds, placed me in it, and sent me down the great river of Egypt, the Nile. My older sister Miriam, who was a child at the time, followed the basket of reeds, and it landed in front of the palace of one of the Egyptian princesses. When this princess saw me in that basket, she knew I was a Hebrew child, because she knew that no loving mother would give up her son unless that child was in danger. So she brought me out of the water, and because I was brought out of the water, she gave me a name. The local people call me Musa. My people call me Moshe. Many of you know me as Moses. So my sister ran back and told my mother where I had landed, and that I was being raised in the palace of the Egyptian princess, in the house of Pharaoh. And my mother and Miriam went to the princess and offered themselves as handmaids to help her raise me. And so I was raised in the house of Pharaoh, a prince of Egypt, with all the privileges and power of a prince of Egypt. But because my mother and sister were the princess's handmaidens, I knew that I was of secret Hebrew origin, of slave origin. This disturbed me, because here it is, I grew up with all the privileges of a prince of Egypt, and all the luxuries and comfort of a prince of Egypt, while my real people were dwelling and toiling in slavery. And this bothered me. It bothered me very much, because I have to warn you, I have a terrible temper. So much so, I could kill. And one day it happened. I was walking through the streets of Egypt, a proud, haughty prince of Egypt, and I saw an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. I was so incensed by it. I went over and I killed that Egyptian taskmaster. But there were witnesses. Well, after all, I was a prince of Egypt. Everybody recognized me. And not just was I recognized because of who I was and for what I did, for I had killed an Egyptian taskmaster in defense of a lowly Hebrew slave. I was now a wanted man, and I had to flee Egypt. And I fled east into the Sinai Peninsula, the desert of Sinai. And I know it seems very humbling, yes, even humiliating, to go from a highly prince of Egypt to a lowly shepherd. But it was also liberating, for I no longer had to defend the hypocrisy and evil that I saw in Egypt. So I became a shepherd, and I learned my way around the Sinai. I learned where the passes were, the oases, the watering holes. This would help us many years later when I would lead the children of Israel through there, for I knew the passageways and where the watering holes were. And so I continued living a simple life and a happy life, a satisfied life, as a mere shepherd. Well, one day I was at one oasis, one watering hole, when I saw some strange men harassing some Midianite women. I chased them away to protect those Midianite women. I befriended them and got to know them very well. One of them I got to know very well. Her name was Zipporah, a beautiful black woman who would become my wife. She bore me 2 sons, Gershon and Eleazar, and her father, my father-in-law, was Jethro, a priest of the Midianites, and from him I would learn much about organizing and leading a people. Well, I continued to lead a simple life of a shepherd, and one day I was tending my flock and I heard someone call my name. Moses, Moses. I heard the voice, but I saw no body. Moses, Moses, who are you? Where are you? And then I saw the strangest sight. There was a bush on fire, but the fire did not consume the bush. I could not understand this. And then I thought I was going crazy. I thought I heard the voice come from the bush. I could not tell if it was coming from the bush or was it coming from my head. But the voice, I continued to hear the voice, Moses, Moses. I looked at this bush and I said, who are you? What are you? And then the voice revealed itself to me. The voice said, Onochi, Onochi, I am that I am. Who are you? What are you? And the voice told me, your ancestors knew me as El Shaddai, the Almighty. But Moses, you and you alone will know me by my personal name. I'm even afraid to say the name here. It is such a holy name. But some people have interpreted the name as Jehovah. Many of you and many of my people knew him simply as Adonai, my Lord. And I asked him, my Lord, what do you want from me? He told me to remove my sandals, for I was standing on holy soil. And then then this voice that called itself the Lord told me that he had made a covenant with my ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they and their descendants would dwell forever in the land of Egypt, but that they were now enslaved in Egypt. And I was to return to Egypt to tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. But I remember when I was speaking and having this conversation, I said, but my Lord, how can I go before the Pharaoh? You see, I had a speech impediment at that time. And the voice said, let your brother Aaron speak for you. But my Lord, the Pharaoh is the ruler of the most advanced and strongest nation on earth. I have no army. I have no power. You see your staff? And I said, yes. Place it on the ground. And I did as this voice commanded me, and it became a serpent. Then I was told to touch it again, and it became a staff again. Then I was told to take my hand, place it into my coat, and remove it, and it became diseased. And then I was told to place it in there again, and it was healed. For I knew I had the power of the Lord behind me. So I returned to Egypt as the Lord had commanded. I was reunited with my younger brother Aaron and my sister Miriam. And with my brother Aaron, I returned to the palace of the Pharaoh. I was not afraid of him. I had grown up with him. I had grown up in the house of Pharaoh. I knew those people. I certainly had never grown up as a slave. Aaron and I confronted Pharaoh, and I knew his heart would be hardened, and I told him, Shalach et ami, let my people go. And the Pharaoh then said, and in whose name do you speak, Moses? I told him, I speak in the name of the Lord God of Israel. Well, where is your Lord God of Israel? Show me his power to you. I warned him that great phenomena would descend upon Egypt that neither he nor his sorcerers nor his visors could explain or control. From southern Egypt, from the upper Nile, red clay was carried down the Nile, polluting the rivers of Egypt, making the Nile, the great river of Egypt, the source of all life and the source of Egyptian civilization. It became as red as blood. And I thought maybe now the Pharaoh would understand. But when the rivers became clear again, his heart was hardened. Hailstones as big as my fist came down and smashed the mud homes of the Egyptians. And I thought now Pharaoh would listen and understand. And it appeared that he was ready to release us. But when the storm ended, he said no. And then I knew, according to my calculations, that a great solar eclipse was about to happen, blocking out the sun. You see, this was very important. The Egyptians worshiped the sun. It was their god, Ra, the great god overseeing everything. And when the solar eclipse happened, and their sun and their god was blocked out during the daytime, they became frightened. And this was followed by a great cloud from a distant volcano, blocking out the sun for several days, frightening the Egyptians because someone had taken away their god. And now Pharaoh, it appeared, was ready to release us. But when the skies cleared, he said, no. Then great swarms of locusts descended upon the fields of Egypt, destroying their crops. And then, to eat those locusts, frogs came out, but they overmultiplied when they ate the locusts. And then great beasts came out to devour the frogs, but then they overmultiplied, and Egypt was covered with great beasts. Cattle came out to stop these beasts. And then the nation became overpopulated with cattle. That caused the spread of disease, lice, and boils that affected the Egyptian people. And now finally I thought, now the Pharaoh would release us. And he was prepared to do so. But when everything had returned to normal and calm resumed and reclaimed the land, Pharaoh canceled his decree and said, no. I realized it would take one last final plague to convince the Egyptian, one deadly plague. The voice that called itself the Lord told me to tell the children of Israel to take the blood of a paschal lamb, paint it on the doorposts of their homes, so this one last plague would pass over us. You know, I might use that name for a future festival. So they did as the Lord commanded, and as I had told them. And this one last plague passed over the homes of the children of Israel and descended upon every house of Egypt. Every firstborn son of Egypt, from the lowest peasant to the royal palace, died. The Pharaoh was devastated. His firstborn son, the heir to the throne, was dead. I was summoned to the palace. The Pharaoh, understandably, was not just in grief, but greatly upset and realized he had been beaten. And he said, Moses, since you returned to Egypt, there has been nothing but trouble descending upon Egypt. Trouble that I do not understand, that my visors do not understand, my ministers, my sorcerers cannot understand or control. And now my oldest son is dead, the heir to my throne. I have nothing to live for anymore. This time I mean it. Take your people and get out of Egypt immediately. I don't want to see any of you again. And I quickly told the children of Israel that we were now liberated from slavery. But I knew that we had to leave quickly, for what if the Pharaoh were to change his mind? We were in such a hurry that we had little time to bake bread properly. We did not have time for the yeast to rise. And what we ended up baking was this unleavened bread, a matzah, because we had so little time to bake bread properly. We baked this very thin unleavened bread like a cracker that we brought with us when we left Egypt. And every year on the anniversary of our liberation from slavery and exodus from Egypt, on the 14th day of the first month, which is the month of Aviv, the spring, when we celebrate our exodus from Egypt and our liberation from slavery, we eat this unleavened bread for 7 days. So we quickly packed up our goods and were ready to, and we left Egypt. And I led the children of Israel east to a place that we call in my language Yam Suf. Now, in your language, I understand you translate it as the Reed Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. You'll have to forgive me, I don't spell very well in your language. Is that with 2 E's or 1 E? You'll pardon me. I led the children of Israel there to the Sea of Reeds, and we camped. In the meantime, the Pharaoh longed for us. Yes, he missed us. Oh, not because he loved us. His labor force was now gone, and no Egyptian would dare do the lowly work of a Hebrew slave. He realized in his grief over mourning of his son that he had made a mistake. He mobilized his army, sent them against us at the Sea of Reeds, and we could see the Egyptian army approaching. And the children of Israel, of course, became frightened. They said, "Moses, have you brought us out here to be slaughtered by the Pharaoh and his chariots?" I said, "Has not the Lord shown you signs and wonders? He will again show you signs and wonders." And then a great miracle happened. And let me tell you something about miracles. Miracles are when the right thing happens at the right time. You see, what happened was, I led the children, this is being in the right place at the right time. I led the children of Israel across the mud flats at low tide across the Sea of Reeds. And yes, as I expected, the Egyptian army was pursuing us. But what happened was, the Egyptian chariots were stuck in the mud. Their soldiers were weighed down by their heavy armor and could not pursue us across the mud flats. We reached the other side of the Sea of Reeds, and then the following day a high tide came in, and the Egyptian army was drowned. My sister Miriam sang a song, Mi chomocho bo elim Adonai, Mi chomocho nedor ba kodesh. Who is like unto you, O Lord, among the mighty? Who is like unto you, glorious in holiness, revered in praises, doing wonders? And now we were ready to continue with our journey to the promised land of Canaan. The most direct route, the shortest route, would have been a northern route, but that would have taken us through the land of the Philistines, a great, mighty, warlike people whom we were not ready to fight. We were newly liberated people. We were not yet a strong nation, and I knew it would be dangerous to go through and fight the Philistines. So I led the children of Israel south through a longer route, through the Sinai Peninsula, an area I had known. After all, I had been a shepherd there. I knew the passes. I knew the passageways and the routes. And I knew where the oases and the watering holes were. But still, the children of Israel were I have to tell you, I would have nothing but problems with them for the next 40 years. A stiff-necked people. As we were going through the desert, they said, "But Moses, at least when we were slaves, we had a roof over our head. We were fed. We had food. We had water. We had shelter. We had clothing. Now we're out here in the middle of the desert with nothing." But I said, "Has not the Lord shown you signs and wonders? He again would show us signs and wonders." I discovered a grove of tamarisk trees. They had a sweet fruit from them. And I told the children of Israel to pick from it for 6 days, and on the 7th day to take a double portion so we could rest on that 7th day. And they asked me, "What is this, Moses? It tastes like anything we imagine it to be." I told them, "Think of it as manna from heaven." And we continued on our journey. And it had been nearly 50 days that we had left Egypt. And already, as I told you, I was having problems with the children of Israel. Not just were they complaining about what they saw as being nostalgic for their days of slavery, when they had security but no freedom. There were also disputes between the different tribes and among the different tribesmen, and I did not know what to do. I asked my father-in-law Jethro. He said, "Appoint judges over the people." And I knew this was a way to help organize. But still, what kind of a people were we going to be? What were to be our guide? What were to live up to? What were to be our standards? And I realized after 50 days, we needed a written standard, a written set of laws to guide us. And we were camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and I felt the voice of the Lord was calling me. So I went up to Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. And there the Lord commanded me to write these commandments that I will share with you. The first one, Anochi Adonai Elohecha hotzeti etcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. This establishes the authority for our law. It comes from a power greater and mightier than any of us, the same power that brought us out of slavery and liberated us from Egypt. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al panai, lo taseh lecha pasal v'chol temunah. You shall not have a graven image before me, nor shall you have other gods before me. For our God is a jealous God. He does not want us to follow false gods or worship idols, or to follow false gods and false values. For idols are made by man and can be destroyed by man. Lo taso et shem Adonai Elohecha l'shav. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain or swear a false oath to him. Treat the name of our Lord respectfully, and do not swear a false oath in his name. Zocher et Shabbat v'shomer kodsho. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Remember, we were slaves in the land of Egypt. We never had a day of rest. Now every 7th day would be a day of rest that we would make holy and separate from the rest of the week. Kibod et avicha ve'et amicha. Respect your mother and your father. This is the basis of our society, the family. Without respect for it, our civilization and society will fall apart. Lo tirtzak. Do not murder. Lo ta'anef. Do not commit adultery. Lo tignav. Do not steal. Lo ta'aneh bere'echa ad sheker. Do not be a false witness against your neighbor. When you testify, tell the truth. Lo tachmod beit recha. Do not covet your neighbor's house and goods. There is nothing wrong with being ambitious and striving for more, but work for it. Do not plot to take from your neighbor what is not yours. These were 10 basic commandments between God and between man and man. But because I'd been away from the children of Israel for 40 days and 40 nights, they thought I had abandoned them. And they worried, and they went to my brother Aaron, and they forced him to make an idol for them. An idol. Can you believe that? After all that the Lord has shown them and done for them, they wanted Aaron to make an idol like the Egyptians did? And when I came down from Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments and saw that they had made a golden calf from the gold they had taken from Egypt, and they were worshiping it and dancing around it, I was angered and furious. I took the commandments, threw them on the ground, and smashed them. And the Lord was ready to destroy them, but I pleaded with the Lord, and I guess if He can forgive them, I can forgive them. So I climbed up and ascended Mount Sinai again, and for another 40 days and 40 nights I carved a new set of tablets. And when I came down from the mountaintop, they said there was a Karan al Panava or, that my face was radiated, that the skin of my face was radiated with light. Well, the word to radiate in my language in Hebrew is karan, to illuminate or to radiate. But some people have mistaken it for keren, meaning horns of light. That people said they saw horns of light coming through my face. I hope they don't think we all have horns. And so we continued on through the desert, and the voice of the Lord would speak to me many times, commanding me to write down new commandments and new laws on how we were to govern ourselves. Eventually, not just 10 commandments, but we added another 603 commandments that we put into a book of law, which we call the Torah, which tells us not just of our origins, but how we are to live and how we are to behave. To remember that we were once slaves in the land of Egypt and that we should respect the stranger and respect the lowly. And that we are to give thanks to the Lord several times per year. The first is in the spring with the Passover on the 14th day of the first month of Aviv, which is a full moon. And then 50 days later, we are to make a grain offering on the festival of weeks of Shavuot, or some of you call it Pentecost, the festival of the first fruits. And then on the first day of the 7th month, there is to be a convocation of horns, followed by 10 days later by a Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, a day of repentance, a Yom Kippur, a day of atonement. That is to be followed 4 days later, again on a full moon, exactly 6 months after the Passover, for another festival to commemorate the autumn harvest. That is called tabernacles, or in Hebrew we call it Sukkot, for we are commanded to build a sukkah, a booth, just as we did when we were dwelling in the desert of Sinai. And we were commanded how we were to govern ourselves, that we were to be a nation of priests, of Kohanim. My brother Aaron would be the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, and his sons and their descendants would be the Kohanim, the Kohens, the priests, that would handle the sacrifices and offerings in our sanctuary, our Mishkan. and we were to eventually approach the land of Canaan, I chose 12 spies, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they went into the land of Canaan, and when they returned, they were actually carrying a big bunch of grapes they were carrying between themselves on their shoulders. And I asked 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, "What have you found?" They told me, "It is Eretz Zavat Chalab Udvash. It is a land flowing of milk and honey." But the other 10 spies said, "Oh no, it is a land full of Anakim. It is a land full of giants. We cannot enter that land. They will defeat us." And I realized we were not ready to enter the land of Canaan. You see, yes, we were free from slavery. We were liberated from slavery, but we had not been liberated from the slave mentality. They still fought like slaves, and they were afraid to take on the responsibility that goes with independence and freedom. And I realized that we would have to wander for nearly 40 years through the desert until a new generation arose, one that had not remembered or had been born in slavery, but had grown up free in the desert, free and independent and responsible, and would be ready to take on those responsibilities and challenges. And along the way, yes, the Lord gave me more commandments which we wrote down in our Torah. And yes, we had to fight many different tribes and kingdoms on the way. And one king, King Balak, he sent his prophet Balaam out to curse us. And instead, the Spirit of the Lord filled Balaam with this. When he saw us, he said, "Ma tovu oholecho Yaakov mishkanotecho Yisrael." How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. It was such a beautiful blessing that we included it in our Torah. And so we continued along. And many times, to find a watering hole or oasis, the Lord commanded me to take my staff and hit a rock, and water came out. But one time I was told not to hit the rock, but to speak softly to it. But you know me, I have such a bad temper, I just one day hit the rock. Yes, water came out, but the Lord was angry with me because I had disobeyed him. And because I had disobeyed him, I was told I could not enter the promised land of Canaan. Now you may think that is such a great punishment for such a minor transgression. And yes, you're right, it is. But you see, I was closer to the Lord than anyone else. And he had higher expectations and standards from me. Just like you have higher expectations from your children. That is how the Lord saw me. And so I could not enter the promised land. But I knew that when the time would come, I would be too old to enter. And now that time has come. I am now 120 years old. I am now a very old man. And the children of Israel are now ready to cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. And as the Lord has commanded, I will not join them, for I'm also an old man now. I will now ascend Mount Nebo, and from there I will be able to see Joshua lead the children of Israel into the land of Canaan. For he has proven to be a great military leader, and I know he will be able to lead the children of Israel against the Canaanites. And he will follow the words of the Lord and the Spirit of the Lord. And so I am now to ascend Mount Nebo, and do not follow me, for I do not want you to take my remains and build a great tomb, or to deify me, for I am merely human. I do not want you to build a great pyramid for me, as was built for the pharaohs of Egypt. The problem with the Egyptians were they worshipped death. We worship life. After all, the Lord has told us, Bachar Chaim, choose life. We are told to live by those laws and to make the best of our lives. Now with that, I am about to leave you, and I leave you with these words, the same words I told Joshua and the children of Israel. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong and be of good courage. Thank you. But I do understand that some of you have some questions for me before I leave you. And if you have any questions for me, Moshe or Moses, I will do my best to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
Where is Canaan now?
Canaan? Some of you, I believe, call it, I've been told, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. I've heard even some people still call it as the land of the Philistines or Palestine. Yes, ma'am.
Did you begat any children?
Did I begat any children? Yes, Gershon and Eleazar. Yes, ma'am. We call that first month the month of Aviv, which is also Hebrew for spring. Aviv. Yes, because after all, we use the moon, we follow the moon for our calendar. Yes, sir.
Just for that lady's question, the hill of spring is Tel Aviv.
Well, that would be a nice name for a village. Tel Aviv. Tell Joshua that. Yes, I see a hand way in the back.
What happened to Miriam?
What happened to Miriam? Well, Miriam did not get along with my wife. And she made some nasty remarks about her being a Cushite or a black woman. And she got leprosy and unfortunately died. Yes, ma'am.
So you did get to see the promised land.
Well, I did see the promised land from Mount Nebo, but I never entered it. I'm an old man already. I wouldn't have had the strength to even cross the Jordan River. Yes, I see a hand way back there. Yes, ma'am.
Where are you buried now?
Where am I buried? Well, I'm going up to Mount Nebo, and that's where I will die. But as I said, don't try to look for my remains. I don't want you to take my bones and build great tombs to me. I'm only human. I'm no God. Yes, ma'am.
There is a monument for this, for you at Mount Nebo.
Oh, there is a well, it certainly was not built in my time. I told you not to build anything in my honor. Just having the children of Israel arrive in the land of Canaan is an honor for me. Yes, sir.
May sound pretty stupid, but when God talks to you, is He talking to anybody now?
Well, He talks to us in our heart and in our minds, does He not? And when we carry out His mitzvot, His commandments, He is speaking to us. We are doing His work. Yes.
It was believed in the Old Testament time that once you got leprosy, that means you had committed sin against the Lord. And your sister died of having a leprosy. Is that because of her being sinful, or what did you say about it?
Why? Well, of course, we also have mitzvot or commandments dealing with leprosy that people are to be isolated and separate from the rest of the community as a health measure. But she received leprosy because of what she said about my wife, which was not a very nice remark. After all, we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Just because somebody is of a different nationality or race or religion, that's no reason to criticize them. Yes, ma'am.
The 600 other laws that are in
Do I know any of them? Yes, well, I wrote them all down as the Lord had commanded me. I mean, I don't remember all of them. I'd have to look in the Torah to read, to see which one. Well, there were 10 of them. The first... Yes, well, there are others. I told you how we are the festivals to celebrate our harvest that we have 3 times a year. We are to make pilgrimages to the great sanctuary at Passover, at Shavuot, and at Sukkot. Well, there's also other laws that we are commanded. After all, one of the first ones was even before I was born, where the Lord said to Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply." There are other laws on leprosy, on how people are to be treated during times of leprosy, on how we are to establish our courts, and that we are to be a holy people, and that we are to be respectful of others, not to put a stumbling block before the blind or to curse the deaf. We are given standards on how we are to live our lives and how we are to behave with one another. On behavior, on sexual behavior, with whom we can marry and whom we cannot.
On what to eat.
And yes, and what to eat. That you shall not seethe the kid in the mother's milk. That you're not supposed to cook milk and meat together. And that we're only supposed to eat animals that chew its cud and have a cloven hoof, such as a cow, but not an unclean animal like a pig. And that we're only to eat fish that have scales. That we are to eat the idea is to make us not just separate from others, but to live a higher standard. That is what the Lord asks us to do. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all very much. Yes, if there's questions you have for me, Peter Small, not Moses, or Moshe Rabbeinu, as they call him in Hebrew. Well, I started doing these characters. I got the idea for it more than 25 years ago. I decided to go into teaching and decided to become a history teacher, actually a U.S. history teacher. And I started doing when I was even doing a student observation, I began to do these in class, or do it for my classes, of dressing up as different historical figures. And I started off, one of the first I did was actually Huey Long, then I did one of Harry Truman, and then over the years I added different historical figures. And in the fall of 1987, I was a student teacher at Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Greenbelt, Maryland, in world history. And I told the cooperating teacher about my background, that I was developing this living history program, and that I'd lived in Israel for a number of years. And we were studying ancient civilizations, and among them, of course, is studying the ancient Hebrews and the rise of monotheism. She says, "Why don't you do Moses?" So I did Moses for the class, but I was also very careful not to preach religion, but to give it a different view of Moses. And I remember the classes enjoyed it. They liked the idea of me dressing up, but that I also gave them something that was, excuse my language, was not the fairy tale version of religion. I explained, as I did to you today, that there are certain mistranslations in the Bible when it was translated from Hebrew to Greek and then to Latin, such as the Red Sea. It's really the Sea of Reeds, and that Moses had an illumination, not horns coming from his head. That's why, by the way, have you ever seen Michelangelo's Moses? He's got little horns there. That's where it came from. So, of course, Moses has horns. You know, all those Hebrews and all those Jews and Israelites also have horns. That's actually where it came from. I pointed out things like that, and then explaining the 10 plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, a little different than what we learned in Sunday school. Doesn't matter whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Mormon or whatever, or Eastern Orthodox. Doesn't matter what our religious background is. I gave it as I say, a more scientific approach to it.
Where all have you performed?
Have I performed? I've performed nationwide. I've been here several times, many times over the last few years. I've performed for schools, retirement homes, congregations, libraries, and museums throughout throughout California. I've been living here in Southern California for 24 years, but I also have performed nationally. And I go annually. I go to the East Coast. I'm going to Florida in mid-October. I also go to the Midwest around Thanksgiving, and I've also been at 4 presidential libraries: the Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Hoover libraries over the last 15 years. I've also performed for Forest Lawn when they had their Living History program. I've participated in the Huey Long Centennial as well as the Thomas Edison Sesquicentennial in Port Huron, Michigan. Moses is about the only biblical character I do. The only other one I've done, and I do that on Yom Kippur at my synagogue, is Jonah. Trouble with Jonah is it's the shortest book of the one of the shortest books of the Bible. It's one of the longest Haftorahs, which is when someone actually chants it in Hebrew. But as far as the book of the Bible, it's very short, so that takes a lot of imagination. How can you come up with so much material for such a short book? Moses at least had 5 books. Yes, New Jersey. Yes, the accent, you caught it. Yes. No, I'm not. I came from a little town called Pompton Lakes. It's about 25 miles northwest of New York City, and my mother actually grew up. And my mother and grandparents grew up on the Lower East Side of New York. Yes?
Where did you live in Israel?
I lived in many different places. I spent a year there in 1976 and 77 on a social work program in Dimona, which is in southern Israel, in the Negev. That's also where Israel's secret nuclear reactor is that no one's supposed to know about, but everybody does. Where Israel supposedly has its non-existent secret nuclear weapons. And then I returned in 1979 and spent nearly 6 years there. I was on 2 kibbutzes, one in the north called Mitsuba, and then one called Yahel down in the south. And then I returned to Dimona, lived there for a year, and then I lived for about 4 years. I worked in Tel Aviv and lived in and around the Tel Aviv area, Ramat Gan, Bnei Brak, Hadar Yosef. Yeah, Medaber Ivrit. לא כל כך טוב, אבל אני מדבר עברית. אני זוכר מעט עברית. Oh, my experiences? Well, there's lots of them. I did all sorts of things. I was a kibbutz volunteer for a year. I spent a year working on one of the an air base project for the United States. I was hired locally as an Israeli and paid in shekels, not dollars. But it was one of the air bases the United States was building for Israel as part of its withdrawal from Sinai. I did that for nearly a year, and I spent 4 years working for the Israeli Automobile and Touring Club. It's their equivalent of the AAA. I also served in a reserve unit of the Israel Defense Forces. I did basic training on the West Bank, and yes, I even patrolled Hebron a couple of times. To younger children, the ones I find that work best with the young children are the ones that are most interactive. That would be George Washington, Thomas Edison, Theodore Roosevelt, and if it's requested, Thomas Jefferson. Oh, well, well, how do I get them interact? Well, actually, I make them come up and be part of the story. When I'm George Washington, I have some of them come up and pretend we're rowing across the Delaware River, freezing at Valley Forge, and then I drill them to show them what was done during that winter. With Thomas Edison, with the children's version, is basically a science demonstration. I have all sorts of homemade props, like my own little telegraph key, which is an oversized electromagnet. Or I have 2 cans and a string. I'm sure we've all done that when we were growing up. And showing them, and I have knots tied on it, when I rub my finger over it, they can actually hear the sounds come across the can. So they understand how sounds vibrate. I have something like a zoetrope, which was an animation wheel. They can see how, and they get the idea behind how motion pictures develop. And I have the kids sometimes actually help me in doing these demonstrations for the audience. And with Teddy Roosevelt, we just act out different parts of his life. I have some of them come up and pretend we're marching, getting ready to march to Cuba, charging up San Juan Hill. Or another part, I pretend we take them on a hike when he's president, where we said over, under, or through, but never around. So I get them involved in the story. Am I working on any new characters right now? No. Well, actually, you asked about FDR. I do FDR. He's one. I don't know if I've done him for. I've done him for. Not yet. No, I haven't done it for this group. Yeah. Of course, the problem is when I do FDR, I have to do him seated because I'm going to be in a wheelchair. Bill Clinton? No. Well, I was asked that question when he was president, and that was what? Over 13, 14 years ago. I said at the time I couldn't do it with a straight face. I'll tell you, there are two presidents of our lifetime who I would enjoy doing, even though I despised them at the time they were president, would be Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Except that would require a good makeup job. No, seriously, Johnson, you'd have to do the ears and the nose, and of course Nixon, the ski nose and the jowls. No, you laugh, but it's true. You want to look as much as you can like the character.
Have you had any drama classes? How did you?
No, my only experience with drama was in high school. I was a member of the drama club, and I did some, we did some productions, but that was it. My interest was always politics, government, and history, never drama or theater. But on the other hand, obviously, I don't mind getting up in front of an audience and speaking either. So. All right, thank you very much. And by the way, for those who observe, Shana Tova, Happy New Year, Good Yontif.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.